Welcome back to the road to the cross. Today we follow Jesus beyond the city gates, outside the walls, where criminals are led to die and the rejected are cast aside. As the cross grows near, Steve and Tim walk with Jesus on the final road, unpacking the weight of his suffering, the symbolism of exile, and the love that drives him forward. This is episode 9, Outside the Walls.
Well, welcome back. We are on the road to the cross, and I think quite literally this time, yeah?
Yes.
The trials have wrapped up, and so we're on the road to Golgotha at this point, yeah?
That's right.
All right. Well, I never know how to get these things started. I always feel awkward, but it's like, I guess we just get started. What do you got for us?
Okay, we'll find out. Well, let me give you kind of the launching verse, which is Luke 23:25. He, Pilate, released the man they asked for. Remember, that was Barabbas. Mm-hmm. Remember, it was Jesus, Barabbas.
Yeah.
Interesting, huh? The one who'd been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. In the following episodes, after these next two, we're going to look beneath the events of the crucifixion, and we're going to try to find some kind of deeper meanings, water to wine. Mm-hmm. And so in my mind, I've had the image of being before the cross, looking up at the cross, and then kind of moving around the cross and seeing it from different perspectives.
Interesting. Yeah. So
we're going to do that. Things like the cross and the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the bronze serpent, the scapegoat, the Passover lamb, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Before you dig in, just you're talking about just kind of facing the cross and looking at it even from different angles. That's a beautiful metaphor, but it reminds me, like, I know that you have enjoyed in the past going into different cathedrals, different worship spaces, and just seeing the crucifix and gazing on that in different spaces around the world. And I know we had a good time talking with Brian Zahn about his book, where he talks a little bit about that too.
Yes.
When you do that, when you enter a new space that maybe you haven't been to before, and you encounter a new crucifix, I guess is what we would call it. I don't know. How do you prepare yourself for that space, or what? Just tell us a little bit about that experience.
Okay, again, a question I've never been asked. Mainly, I try and still and quiet my soul like a weaned child. Psalm 131. I do. I just try to get quiet, and I just watch it. That sounds like it's moving, but it almost like it is. And just whatever the Lord wants to stir up in me. Yeah. And I'll talk about this in a couple of minutes when we get to the Stations of the Cross. But it can be just adoration. It can be repentance. It can be just being overwhelmed. This would be the most common, just overwhelmed by the price that Christ paid.
There are a lot of different styles. Even depending on which tradition you're entering into, you may find Christ on the cross, or you may find the cross empty. Are there any particular representations or styles or anything that you resonate with more than others, just artistically or anything?
Well, Christ on the cross rather than the empty cross, which I understand. It's pointing to the resurrection. There's some wonderful Eastern Orthodox icons, beautiful, beautiful icons of the cross. And there's some very modern, rather stylistic. Mm-hmm. For me, more realistic, I think.
Yeah.
Although some of those Eastern icons are semi-realistic, others are very realistic.
Yeah. All right. Well, sorry, I interrupted you before you even get started, but there you go.
Well, here we go. So we've been following the gospel writer's narrative approach. We started in the upper room 9 weeks ago, I guess, and today and tomorrow are the last following this narrative. Yeah. And I'm certainly not saying we've just looked at the literal. We've had many a time we've looked at water to wine and so forth, but like we've said for many seasons, learning to read Scripture at a literal, a moral, at a spiritual or water to wine level, you start with the literal. And so in one sense, we've started with the more literal approach. Now, an interesting thing has happened to me just in the last couple of days. It occurred to me that our podcast series largely parallels what's known as the Stations of the Cross.
Oh, interesting.
And, for a lot of years, and you just alluded to that and didn't know where I was going, but when I'm in cathedrals, when I'm in churches, I take a little time and I look at the Stations of the Cross. I'm always impacted by them. Sometimes they're really simple. The church in our city, in Old Town, is one of the oldest churches in America, and it's extremely simple. It was a church really built for the peasant class, and that's reflected in the Stations of the Cross, which are pictures.
Yeah.
As you know, St. Francis Basilica in Santa Fe, they're fairly modern, but they're powerful. Mm-hmm. The most powerful ever, I alluded to it a few years ago, is when I was in Bogota. I took a cable car up to the top, and there the Stations of the Cross were around the whole grounds as these powerful statues. It really, really impacted me.
I was in Bogota earlier this year, and we did a different one. We went to the caves, the salt mines, the old salt mines, and they've done Stations of the Cross down there. Yeah, but it is very modern and a little too. I didn't quite get it. Maybe I'm just not a deep enough person, but they had to explain it to me what I was even looking at.
Well, whether they're modern, highly stylized, or whether they're very realistic, there's always 14 of them. I don't know if you've noticed that. And it's interesting because you find the Stations of the Cross in Catholic churches, but also in Lutheran and Anglican and Methodist, the liturgical tradition. The Stations of the Cross are a really important part. So I did a little research, thought, well, where does this go back to? And probably the real origin goes way back, probably the 6th century, when the pilgrims were visiting the Holy Land. Then they started to walk the Via Dolorosa, which is the walk from, remember we talked about the Antonia, I always say it with the Czech translation because of a book that I love, the Antonia Fortress, which was the place where Pilate was, and that's where he stood, and he caved into the mob. And it goes from there all the way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it's interesting because I was surprised and that's the walk that Jesus walked with the cross.
How long is that walk?
I was just going to tell you. Just over a third of a mile.
Oh.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I assumed it was a couple of miles.
Yeah.
No. Now, St. Francis of Assisi is often credited with the beginning of this tradition, and I went into my research assuming I was going to find that out, but not so much. It was actually the order that he founded, the Franciscans, 100 years later. The Pope made them guardians of the holy sites in Jerusalem. And so they popularized those holy sites as stations. But it wasn't until the 1600s when the 14 Stations of the Cross were kind of standardized, they were standardized. The first 6 we followed. They start with Gethsemane. Well, we actually went 2 hours before that in the upper room. Gethsemane, to his arrest, to Peter's denial, to the trials we just finished looking at, and the scourging. And then 7 to 14, I always find this so profound when I look at these stations. And I'm just going to read them. The first one, Jesus takes up his cross. Then Jesus is helped by Simon of Cyrene to carry his cross. We talked about that last episode. Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. He says, "Don't cry for me," right? The fourth, Jesus is crucified. And then he promises his kingdom to the repentant thief. We talked about that. And we're going to look at this quite a bit a little later. Jesus entrusts Mary and John to each other. Jesus dies on the cross, and Jesus is laid in the tombs. I think that the Stations of the Cross, whether we're from a Protestant or evangelical tradition, when there's opportunity to go into a cathedral or something, they serve as a wonderful point of meditation, just like for me the crucifix does.
Yeah.
But and they really lead me to adoration and again to repentance and wonder. Okay, that occurred to me really strongly a couple of days ago, so I thought I'd do a little research on that because it does seem to parallel the journey we've taken. So now let's get into today's session. The history of crucifixion. Crucify is from a Latin word for torture or torment. From this, we get the word excruciating.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So it was the worst known form of execution. A criminal not only was in agony and eventually died, but along the way, they were left with no shred of dignity. And so at first, the early centuries of crucifixion, it was reserved only for slaves. Later, it was extended to deserters and the lowest of offenders, but never for Roman citizens, ever, no matter what. They died other ways, but not by that. It was intentionally humiliating. And why? Because the Romans were wanting to discourage any rebellion. They wanted to do it through fear, but also through shame. There was nothing in the known world, whether you were a Gentile or a Jew or a Christian, there was nothing ever more shameful than crucifixion. Now, it's interesting, for the Jews, crucifixion was a clear sign that the condemned was cursed by God. I think this contributes to how hard it was for the Jews to embrace the gospel because he was cursed. Let me read you Deuteronomy 21 to 23. When someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You must bury him that same day, for anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you for possession. So this is a pretty big deal for them, specifically being hung on a tree or cross. And we know even in our hymns, tree and cross are often interchangeable. So for the Jews, it was pretty clear. Just like for them, sickness, calamity, poverty was a clear sign. Crucifixion was a clear sign of divine judgment.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be very careful in our day not to fall into this. We so easily can fall into a rather simplistic dualism. Oh, good things are happening to me. I must be in a good place spiritually, right? Or bad things are happening to me. What have I done wrong?
Yeah.
I mean, you and I have both heard that 100 times.
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty important we don't fall into this. Since there was nothing worse than crucifixion, the priests who were accusing, the Sanhedrin, they did all they could to make sure that Jesus would specifically die this way, by crucifixion. They didn't want him stoned. Because there was so much shame. This for them was, see, there's the final proof he's a blasphemer.
Yeah.
And he's utterly rejected by God. So it was very intentional on their part.
Yeah. Have we picked up any of that? And you say utterly rejected by God, and of course I'm immediately put back into stuff we're going to talk about later in terms of penal substitutionary atonement in a few weeks, but about that theory that God was punishing him, abandoning him for our sins, and turning his face away from him and things like that. Do you think that a portion of that has actually been picked up from even that Jewish understanding of accursed by God, like hanging on a tree?
Could be.
1 + 1
I
=
hadn't
2.
thought about that, but yeah, it could have carried right over into our Christian tradition, although not at all in the first 1,000 years. I've been doing a lot of reading the last few days on the church fathers around the crucifixion, and there isn't even a hint of that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about the whole issue of shame, because if we don't really get a hold of this, we brush over it too quickly, we're going to miss some layers of significance. I'm sure that the disciples could not have seen his humiliating, terrible death on a cross as his obedience to God or as a vindication for his mission. For them, this was a total disaster, right? Which is a big part of why I think they ran away. It was a crucifixion, and therefore they must have experienced it as discrediting what Jesus had claimed.
All this that we have invested into for years, that we believed, we got duped. It wasn't legit. Is probably at least some of the underlying emotions.
And that was substantiated by the fact that the highest religious authorities in the land were saying exactly that.
Yeah.
And they said he's a blasphemer deserving of death. So I think probably we shouldn't be too hard on the disciples that they all scattered and deserted him. Because let's face it, we all go, what? But that was very much in play. Roman crucifixion was not like an execution in the Western world. I've heard it for 45, 50 years. Well, you know, if it was nowadays, we would have an electric chair around our neck, right? It wasn't, because crucifixion was not quick, and it certainly was not private.
I was just going to say incredibly public, and they did that on purpose, right?
Yes.
Like it was, and I've heard about them even doing it on mass along the side of the highways.
Yes.
Yeah. And this, we know, Golgotha was a hill. It was a mountain. I mean, it was on
Everybody
display.
would see.
Yeah.
And so the parallel with modern execution is an imperfect one. It was meant to stress the gulf between the criminal and the rest of the people.
Oh, interesting.
We're back to it's them, not us, right?
Yeah.
And the gulf between the wickedness of the criminal and the righteousness of good citizens. You see, it's like really bad parenting. You'll hear Jimmy and Johnny. Jimmy does something bad. You're really bad. And then you say to Johnny, but you're a good boy.
Yeah.
Right? Terrible parenting.
Or what? Yeah, the opposite to Jimmy. Hey, why
Wish
can't
it
you be
never
more
happened.
like Johnny?
Yeah.
Right? Which is what they hear.
That's right. So it was designed to be almost like theater. And it was a form of entertainment for the people. By the way, I've been reading quite a bit of stuff from the 15th and 16th and 17th century Britain. The gallows were made really high so everybody could see, not because you had to fall 20 feet for the work. And people showed up, families showed up with picnic baskets. Yeah, and there were people selling stuff.
Yeah.
So it's not like, how did that ever happen? It happened.
Yeah.
So, and the crowds shouting, and, you know, we see all this, you know, we're going to hear a little bit of what they say, save yourself, yada, yada, yada. It brings out the worst of human impulses. Yeah. It really, really does. Mob violence is terrible. Mob influence, you know, it's this, I don't know. Have we talked at all about mimetic theory on this podcast? Not yet.
I don't think so.
We'll wait for a little later when we get to scapegoat.
How's that for a teaser?
But it's about the incredible power. I'll give you a teaser of the crowd.
Yeah.
And of fear and of wanting to know what's expected.
Yeah.
Peter.
Yeah.
I will never leave you.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, he's just had the most intimate thing of his whole life, the upper room, eat my flesh, drink my blood. An hour and a half later, he denies he even knows him. Is he schizophrenic? No. It's this whole deeply entrenched thing of being influenced by the behavior and words of people around us. Yeah. That's just a little teaser for when we get to scapegoat. Okay, so we still see, right, the power of the mob mentality, whether it's violence, We think of riots, mob violence in our day. We don't go very many days without it popping up somewhere in the world.
Sure. Well, and what's interesting too is then you'll hear from people who have been caught up in that mob mentality and having to give an account for it, usually in front of a judge or something, days, weeks, months later, and now they are, I would even say, sober. They're no longer drunk on the mentality of the mob. They've now got sobriety, and they go, I don't even know what I was thinking. I don't know why I would have taken those actions. I don't know why I would behave that way.
And we see it all the time. We saw it in Portland.
Yeah.
We see it. Well, we'll move on.
Yeah.
So now that's just to give you a background on how terrible the crucifixion was, even aside from the spiritual battle with the powers of darkness. So let's start to go through the events. We're back to the whole idea of the Stations of the Cross. The sign. There was a placard announcing the crime committed. That was called the titulus, if you care. And it was carried through the streets for anyone condemned for crucifixion to the place of execution. It was carried by a soldier at the head of the procession with the criminal behind them. And Pilate had the sign to say, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And to make sure everybody got it, it was in Hebrew, Greek, languages, and Latin, so nobody could miss.
I'm surprised you didn't get Braille on there, too.
Yeah. Why? I think Pilate was really angry with the chief priest because he had been blackmailed. He'd been forced into something that I don't think he wanted to do, and we talked about that last week or the week before. They're saying to him, if you let Jesus go, then you're betraying Rome. So he puts this up, and they were so insulted by this sign. They said, no, don't write King of the Jews. Say he said he was. I've written it.
It's done.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's done. And he wanted, to, in a sense, the shame of the cross to be shared by all the Jews. If Jesus was publicly proclaimed their king, right? St. Augustine saw something prophetic in the three languages. He didn't note Braille, by the way. The languages showed that Christ would reign not only over the Jews, but over all nations, and that, quote, not even by killing him could they manage not to have him as their king. Chrysostom. Pilate sentenced their tongues and the tongues of all who might wish to malign him, and so he set the inscription in place as if it were to serve as a kind of trophy, giving voice to a splendid message, both proclaiming his victory and heralding his sovereignty. In other words, Pilate had one thing. It was to just stick it to the Jews. But he didn't understand how prophetic
the accidental prophet
doing. Yeah. He was heralding the universal sovereignty of Christ.
Yeah.
So the next, unless you want to say something.
No,
okay.
No, that's great.
Carrying the cross. It was actually not, in all likelihood, it's very probable that it was not the vertical and horizontal cross. It would have been too heavy. It just probably wasn't. Because what was done for Roman crucifixion was a cross beam, and they were tied to it and had to carry it. It weighed about 70 pounds, and his arms were stretched out and tied to the beam, forcing him to bend forward under its weight. So everybody would have kind of had that same bending. It was purposely really rough wood. And just think of Jesus. It would have just rubbed against his flayed
Yeah, because they've just scourged him.
And Simon of Cyrene appears in the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, but not in John. And I looked at this and I wondered, Mark, as we know, was the original gospel source. Mark was part of the church in Rome. And we know that Simon's son Rufus, and perhaps his other son Alexander, was part of that church. So it would have provided an extra note of interest to them as he wrote his gospel. They'd go, whoa, we know who Simon is.
Yeah. The first time I heard that, it was said almost like taking it for granted because there's mention of Rufus later in the New Testament, and somebody just said, "Yeah, see, same guy, son of Simon." And how certain are we of that? Like, is that church tradition? How did we make that conclusion?
I only know it that as I checked various sources, it kept coming up.
Yeah. So,
but I don't know if it's tradition. I don't think we can throw away all the historical pieces in Acts and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably know more about Acts than I do. I know that's one of your favorite books, and I think it's very credible. I mean, Mark was from the church in Rome.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and it makes sense to me, actually. What you've just said, sometimes you got to kind of put some of these different pieces of evidence together, right? And so what you said in terms of Mark, including it because he was likely part of that church community, his son Rufus was. And so to be able to connect some of the characters would be actually quite powerful and help ground the text, ground the narrative for the audience.
For sure. Yeah. For sure. Now, it's interesting that this incident is not found in John's account. And I wondered a little bit about that too. I think it's because, as always, John has crafted his gospel where every verse, every phrase is heading toward his specific purposes. And those are obviously multi-layered. We've talked about that. John was stressing the theme that Jesus went to his death as the sole master of his own destiny. We're going to talk a little more about this in the next episode, but Jesus said, I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have the power to lay it down, the power to take it up again. That could be one of the reasons why he doesn't include anybody else. Also, it's likely that John was, this is really interesting, and I'm going to develop this later, but John was introducing the typology, picture from the Old Testament of Isaac carrying the wood in Genesis 22.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that little parallel before. Yeah. Very interesting.
Because I'm just reading through Genesis is one of the places right now, and it just jumped out at me the other day. Wow. Again, it says very specifically, Abraham put the wood on Isaac's back to carry it up Mount Moriah.
Yeah. Wow. Because, of course, it's a very famous passage in terms of substitutionary text. It's the introduction of this substitutionary atonement idea. But I'd never thought of that, even just that little detail that John wants us to focus on. Wow.
Oh, there's so many details. I didn't put it in here because, believe me, I could just, this
we
thing
could go on
be
forever.
Part 126, But just jumped into my mind. Some of the church fathers, it might be Irenaeus who first saw it, so that in Isaiah 9 that we read every Christmas, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, he said that's the crossbeam.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that interesting? Oh. That's the way God's government works.
Wow.
That was a freebie. It's not in my notes.
Which, ironically, of course, is a symbol of the government of his day that they've put upon his shoulders. Yeah. Wow.
Okay, we'll move on.
Yeah.
Women lamenting. Luke tells us that there were many women weeping for Jesus in the midst of this terrible miscarriage of justice. And this weeping, it carried some of the Jews along. Not everybody was mob screaming at him. Some were just weeping. There were some women then who saw what had truly happened, and perhaps who Jesus really was. And their response was to mourn and lament. What hits me as I get older, as indeed so far I do, is the place of lament. I've really, really come away from my earlier days of victory. Well, there is victory.
Sure.
But victory can deny lament.
Yeah.
And sometimes in the midst of injustice, all we can do is lament. We're in a season now where there's terrible injustice. Yeah. In a couple of places in the world right now. And I can't fix it.
Yeah.
I can pray, but I can lament. And that's what these ladies were doing.
Is there a danger of staying in lament and not? I'll use this phrase, leaving it at the foot of the cross, of having that time of mourning, but then, moving on from Good Friday to Easter morning.
I don't know. I don't think there's nearly as much danger of that as just moving
Of
on.
bypassing it entirely. Yeah.
And let's face it, Gaza has just torn me up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been going, I don't know how long. What is it, 9 months, 10 months? I don't remember how long. No, longer than that.
Yeah.
Way longer than that. Year and a half. Yeah. It's torn me up multiple times. So I don't come to it and go, oh, well, I already lamented over that. If he brings me back to it, that's where I am.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yep.
So Jesus responds to these ladies and says, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. He was prophesying, of course, what was about to happen in their kids' generation.
And it's no surprise to me to see that you've pulled this from Luke, because Luke, I think, more than any of the other gospel writers, just keeps on coming back. Jesus just keeps on hammering home this, guys, it is not going to end well for you.
This will not be good for you. That's right. Let's go to the next part, that he goes to Golgotha, which is outside the city. The cross, the way to the cross was to go outside the walls. We're going to do a whole segment on the scapegoat. That comes from Leviticus 16. But for those who maybe aren't aware, the high priest, once a year, he prays, and all the sins of the people he puts onto the head with his hands, symbolically, I guess, but he puts it on a goat, and then somebody takes him out into the wilderness far enough that he won't come back, and then leaves him alone. It's outside the walls. And I think following the Jesus way is very likely at various times in our lives to lead us outside the camp of the majority. Yeah. This has certainly been my experience. I was reminded of it again 2 days ago when I said to my wife, coincidentally your mother, I said, why isn't this? And she said, you're outside the camp.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Well, and of course, Jesus told us over and over again, right? I mean, even just blessed are those who are persecuted for my name's sake. He did say this will happen.
If you're going to follow me,
yeah,
look where we're going.
Yeah.
Okay, that's talking about the cross. Let's look a little bit more at the events. First, the physical dimension of crucifixion. It is interesting that none of the gospel writers describe the crucifixion. Simply, they say he was crucified. They don't want to focus on the details of this. They left that to Mel Gibson. But the worst part of crucifixion was the abject humiliation of it. The 4-inch Roman square nails caused terrible pain, damaged the nerves, and continually rubbed against the nerves. So it was just like on fire. There was a gradual death by asphyxiation because the only way to breathe is to pull yourself up, and eventually there isn't the strength to do that. And then I looked at Psalm 22:14. It's the most incredible prophetic psalm about the crucifixion. I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. The strength is gone out of the shoulders. Another related cause of death was shock. In extreme shock, the blood pressure drops precipitously. I don't know I have suffered shock a couple of times in my life, and your blood pressure just goes.
Yeah.
Well, if that goes on, which it did, the organs are starved for oxygen, and the actual tissues of the organs begins to break down.
Oh.
Yeah. There's extreme dehydration. Think about it. He's had all night. He was arrested. He's been interrogated 3 times, and carrying the cross, the exertion of that. So he is dehydrated. Psalm 22, the next verse, 15. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws.
Love it when we can get the word potsherd in.
Yeah, I never use that word. We'll move on. The soldiers gamble for his clothing. Psalm 22:18. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now, this is interesting because under Roman law, when someone was convicted of a crime, all his property was confiscated. Interesting. And sometimes it could be a senator who gets out of pleasure or favor, rather. Everything's confiscated.
Yeah.
And the only property that Jesus owned was his clothes. And getting his clothes was a perk for the soldiers. A crucified guy, you get his stuff. And John tells us they gambled for Jesus' robe, and it was seamless. We all probably know that. And that was very rare in those days. So it was fairly valuable. But Jesus watched as they unwittingly fulfilled this prophecy of, the gamble for my. But I think that there's a prophetic significance. I don't think it's that he went to, Brooks Brothers instead of Target for his robe. The high priest wore a seamless robe. It was rare. Not hardly anybody wore them, but a high priest did. Now, Christ is not a priest in his earthly ministry, but he is the great high priest of heaven. The author of Hebrews emphasizes this 35 times.
Yeah, he had a point to
So
make.
it's another prophetic picture or indication of what's going on. The robe was a witness to his eternal, mystical priesthood, and it was at that very moment that he was offering himself as the perfect Passover lamb because he was the perfect high priest. Let's go to the two thieves. Then two bandits were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. I pointed this out in season 5. The only other place where one on his right and one on his left appears is when James and John asked to sit with Jesus in heaven on either side of his throne.
It's a brilliant literary device.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Jewish authorities unintentionally helped to fulfill Isaiah's prophecy from 53, verse 12. He poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Old Testament prophecy, sometimes you just shake your head. Wow. Good old Chrysostom. The very things which they did to revile him were the ones that contributed to revealing the truth in order that you might learn its power. The word used to describe them, the thieves, is the same word they used for Barabbas, and it meant highway robber or revolutionary. I think pretty likely they were revolutionaries, actually. Jesus was crucified with the two thieves, so he would be associated he would be associated with not only disreputable men, but violent insurrectionists. Again, the Jewish leaders are trying to portray him as a lawbreaker, and this is the opposite of what he taught and modeled. And we went through that a few weeks ago.
And warned against again and again and again, as I said in Luke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The mocking. The initial mockery by the soldiers now shifts to, right at the foot of the cross, to mockery from the Jews themselves. Jewish leaders had schemed for months, and now they were gloating over their success. Remember, we see it in the Gospels. This has gone on for months. They've been trying to get to this point, and they got it.
Yeah.
But their gloating was very ironic because they didn't know what they were saying. That's the irony. There had great theological significance. Matthew 27:39-40. You want to read that?
Those who passed by deriding him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross."
So what they're saying in a mocking way is, in fact, they're speaking the truth. His messianic authority does mean the end of the temple.
Yeah.
And then he say, if you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. In the Jewish eyes, this was his great crime, the Son of God. We talked about that. You're allowed to even say Messiah, but you can't say Son of God. That's blasphemy. And this, by the way, if you are the Son of God, where did we hear that? We heard it in Luke 4. We heard it when Satan says, if you're the Son of God.
Yeah.
Right? So it's so demonic. It's so demonic. Jesus must have lived with the ongoing temptation to prove himself. Satan said, just prove it. These Jewish leaders, just prove it, which he could have done in a flash. But the ongoing temptation of that. But he said in John 4, I have food that you know not of. My food is to do the will of my Father.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's 4:35. And then verse 42, he saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe him. The word sozo, the same word means either heal or save. The very same word. Yet this is exactly what Christ was accomplishing on the cross. It was on the cross because of that we're healed of our spiritual illness and restored to wholeness in our relationship with the Father. It's healing that's going on for us. And as we've said many a time, sin is not something that needs to be punished, it needs to be healed. His very name means salvation, right? Remember that? Jesus, that means he will save. He chose not to save himself, and by that choice, he saved humankind. When he does not come down from the cross, the Jews saw this as proof. See, he's a false Messiah. But the church saw this as proof that he's the true Messiah. He's the suffering servant that had been prophesied by Isaiah. He is the righteous, innocent one of the Psalms. And then the darkness falls and the veil is torn. The curtain, the veil, separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could go in, as we know, once a year. At the crucifixion, this separation ended for all time, and this symbolizes the new covenant. I won't go on that long. Most of us have heard teaching about that. But I wanted to point out a little bit about this darkness that fell from 12 till 3.
Yeah, it's right in the middle of the day.
Yeah, and I still hear some people say, well, it was an eclipse. There is no record of any eclipse lasting longer than 12 minutes.
Why do you think it is that we reach for scientific explanations or natural explanations of something that could be supernatural?
Because at some level, some of us are afraid of mystery. Mm-hmm. We're afraid of that which goes beyond the rational, that goes beyond the five senses. When I was young, this trend had gotten very strong, so that in a Sunday school class, when I was a real little guy, the parting of the Red Sea was actually just that the Red Sea was only knee deep, and they just walked across shallow water, which makes the drowning of the Egyptian forces quite interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But so I don't think we've gone that far. We kind of snap back, but there's still something in us that resists the naturally unexplainable.
Yeah.
I was teaching at my church the other day about he transcends natural law. Not all the time, but sometimes he does.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and I can give you more. The Passover was at full moon, and you can't have an eclipse when there's a full moon. This was an unnatural darkness. That's what this is about. This is a continuation of the point I made a few weeks ago at Gethsemane, the growing darkness over everything, the spiritual darkness.
Suddenly that spiritual darkness manifests itself in the physical space. Yeah.
So I think we've covered enough for today. I'm not going to give a conclusion. We're just going to take a break, and then I'm going to look next session at the 7 sayings of Christ, which I think is very rich stuff.
Yeah.
So any last questions or comments?
No, because I'm afraid I'll get you into next week's stuff. So maybe we'll wait until we wrap up next week, and then if I've got anything left over, I'll ask. But
Okay.
This has been really good.
Great.
Boy, that Isaac carrying the wood thing up, that's just a fun little tidbit that I had never thought of. That's great. And same with the sign, him making the sign, and the accidental prophet. And that's happening really all over the place, really. If you the number of times today you pointed out how they were fulfilling those prophecies in Psalm 22, which when, the cry of dereliction, Jesus is really just trying to put up his own giant neon sign of like, hey, this is it, guys, it's happening, it's on. This is the fulfillment of Psalm 22. But the number of times people are accidentally fulfilling these prophecies through their own cruelty.
They don't tear the robe of the high priest, of the robe, because it's seamless. And it was just the high priest that wore seamless robes.
Yeah, wow. Man, some good stuff here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dad. I hope you're enjoying this. We've really enjoyed seeing your comments on YouTube. Keep that up. Please, share it with others. That's how we help to get the word out. I hope that this has been a valuable resource for you so far, but share it with others. If there's a favorite episode of yours or just even a little favorite little bit, send it to somebody, say, hey, check out minute 23, whatever it is, because we want more and more people to get this stuff, and we want to hear from them. Also, we're trying to get my job. He's the great teacher. I'm the guy who's trying to get people more aware of what Impact Nations is doing around the world. So if you'll permit me, I heard a great story just a couple days ago, a tragic story that turned out good in the end. You got a minute for me to share a story? One of the things we do at Impact Nations is we are rescuing teenage girls who have been abused and abandoned and left pregnant and alone. And, I say that a lot. If you're a regular listener, I say this often here. But sometimes you hear a story and suddenly it grips you like, oh, that's what it means to be pregnant and alone. Quite literally. A couple of years back, our team had we were able to help them purchase an ambulance because they're now servicing a huge portion of Uganda where there's really only one hospital for a massive radius that can properly provide health care.
And TRG was suffering with, unfortunately, numerous times of maternal or infant mortality on the way to try to get to the
because
hospital.
we're driving oftentimes in the back of a taxi cab for 2 hours across Ugandan roads, by the way, look like a minefield. And so we were able to purchase them an ambulance, and they've been able to serve some folks. Well, but there are local clinics where we're working with the local clinics to create what we call safe motherhood spaces. So we've got clinicians who have been trained on how to just serve with empathy and compassion those who are shunned by society. When you are a 15-year-old girl or what have you, and you are pregnant, you are instantly looked at as dirty, shameful, whatever it is. Anyway, our team was at one of these local clinics helping a girl who was in one of our shelters. We have 3 shelters across Uganda alone. One of the young ladies, I think 15-year-old girl, was in labor, and so our team was with her because we're with her. So much of this is about family, about belonging, right? She's no longer alone. And so they went to be with her and bring her supplies and all these things. And when they got to the clinic, they saw that there was another young lady, 17 years old, who was in labor in very serious distress and was all alone. She did not have a friend in the world, did not have any family, nobody to care for her. And our team saw that, the local doctor there was able to bring their attention to it because they've been trained to recognize these things. And our team kicked it into high gear. And they said to the doctor, what does she need? And they said, well, she needs a C-section very quickly, but we do not. We're not a surgery here. We can't manage that. Went back to the clinic, to our shelter, I should say, got the ambulance, rushed back to the clinic, loaded her into the ambulance and rushed her. I mean, she was in serious distress. Cared for her along the way because it's an ambulance equipped with the equipment they need. Got her there, got her a C-section in time, saved her life, definitely saved the mother's life and the baby's life. Baby born, happy, healthy baby, happy, healthy mom. Everybody's doing okay. And now she belongs to community, of course. She's got people who care for her. That's just a little bit of what we do.
Oh, I love it.
So if you'd like to give to something like that, we can help you with that. Just head to impactnations.com, hit the give button. and help us get that job done. That ambulance didn't buy itself. Those folks that were there serving at the clinic that day, they, all of those things, it frankly just takes a lot of money to make that happen. But I tell you what, it's happening. It's happening all over the globe, and we're seeing it. And that is compassion in action. That is the kingdom of God coming to the here and now and penetrating this present darkness and bringing light. And so we thank you, all who are faithfully giving. Thank you so much.
Yes.
We couldn't do it without you. We're so thankful for the Impact Nations family. And if you'd like to join that family, come join us. ImpactNations.com. Learn more about it. Hit the give button and watch and see what God does with your gift. Anyway, enough about that. Thank you for being with us today. We release these podcasts every Thursday. If you're on YouTube, you know the deal. Hit the bell, hit subscribe, all that stuff. By the way, we release some of these stories on video too. So if you subscribe on YouTube, you're also going to get some bonus material as well that way. Or if you like the audio version, subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Leave us a 5-star review. It really helps get the word out. And we're going to see you again next week. We're going to pick up right where we left off with the 7 sayings. And I'm looking forward to that too.
All right.
Thanks so much. God bless.
Bye-bye.